You think you know the French Revolution, right? The Bastille, the guillotine. But what if I told you the real fight, the one that's still going on, wasn't on the streets of Paris? It was in history books. That's what we're diving into today. Not just the revolution itself, but the story of the story, how it's been told and retold and fought over for more than 200 years. So let's get into it. Okay, let's kick things off with a number. 7. That's it. 7. That's how many prisoners were actually in the Bastille on the day it was stormed. And get this, they weren't exactly a who's who of political prisoners. We're talking 4 forgers, 1 aristocrat locked up because of some family drama, and a couple of guys considered lunatics. Not quite the heroic freedom fighters you might picture, huh? So that's the big question, right? If this supposedly terrifying prison was basically empty, how on earth did this one event become the spark that lit the fuse for a revolution that literally changed the world? Well, the answer isn't really about the building itself. It's about the story they started telling about it, right from the second its gates were broken down. All right, so before we dive into all the different versions of the story, let's just lay out the facts. What actually went down on that day in Paris? And you've got to understand, the key word here is symbol. The Bastille's real power wasn't about who was locked inside. It was about what it meant to the average person in Paris. Every time they looked at it, this huge, ugly medieval fortress, it was a giant stone reminder of the king's absolute power. He could do whatever he wanted to whoever he wanted, and that building was the proof. So the day itself just kept escalating. It started with a crowd demanding gunpowder, but that quickly spiraled into a full-on siege. I mean, we're talking hours of chaos. Then some of the king's own guards switched sides, bringing cannons with them. That was the game changer. By late afternoon, the fortress surrendered. And just like that, the symbol was gone. But this victory came at a huge cost. Nearly 100 of the attackers were killed. And the defenders? Only 1 died during the actual fighting. But, and this is a really grim sign of what was to come, the governor of the fortress and a few of his men were killed by the mob after they had already surrendered. The violence was just getting started. Okay, so the smoke has barely cleared, and a whole new battle kicks off. This one wasn't fought with cannons, but with pen and ink. It was a battle over the meaning of what just happened. People started writing the history of this thing immediately, and believe me, their stories could not have been more different. So, on one hand, you had the conservatives, like the famous writer, Edmund Burke. To him, this was just chaos, a horrific mess where a mindless mob was destroying a perfectly good society. But on the other hand, you had liberal thinkers who saw it as this grand story of progress. For them, it was the heroic triumph of the people over a corrupt and broken system. And right there, you have the 2 battle lines drawn for pretty much every debate that would follow. So for years, it was basically team chaos versus team progress. But then, fast forward to the 20th century, and this new, incredibly powerful theory comes along. One that seemed to explain everything. A single grand story for the whole revolution. And this was the Marxist interpretation, what historians now call the classic view. The big idea here, pushed by guys like Shorts-Lefebvre, was that the revolution wasn't some random event. It wasn't a conspiracy. Nope. It was completely inevitable. It was a class war that had been brewing for centuries. The Marxist model is actually pretty straightforward. It goes like this. Step 1, you've got this old, worn-out aristocracy that's in decline. Step 2, you've got a new entrepreneurial middle class, the bourgeoisie, that's getting super rich and powerful economically. Step 3, conflict. The 2 groups clash. And step 4, the bourgeoisie wins, seizes political power, and creates a modern capitalist state. See? It's a neat, tidy story. And for a very long time, this was basically accepted as the truth. But then, things started to change. Around the 1960s, a new wave of historians started digging back into the archives. And when they looked really closely at the evidence, they realized the classic story didn't quite add up. So just to recap that classic Marxist tale, it's a straightforward class struggle, right? Bourgeoisie versus aristocracy. It's all about economics. Capitalism beats feudalism. A really simple, powerful story. Okay, now watch how the next group of historians, the revisionists, just pick that story apart. They were like, hold on a minute. A historian named Alfred Cobbin looked at who the revolutionary leaders actually were. And guess what? They weren't rich factory owners. They were mostly struggling lawyers and government officials. The revisionists also pointed out that feudalism was pretty much dead and gone by 1789 anyway. Their conclusion? This wasn't some inevitable economic event. It was a political revolution, driven by new ideas and maybe just a little bit of luck and chaos. And this quote from François Furet, one of the top revisionist historians, really sums it up. He basically said, hey, France, you need to stop treating the revolution like this magical origin story that explains everything about modern life. He wanted people to see it for what it was, incredibly complex, super messy, and ultimately a story about human beings making difficult choices. So, where are we now? If the big, simple story is gone, what do we have instead? Well, the answer is a whole lot of different stories. Yeah, the days of having one grand theory to explain the whole thing are over. Historians today pretty much agree that the revolution was just way too complicated to be shoved into a neat little box with a single cause or a simple good guys versus bad guys label. Instead, what we have now is a whole bunch of different lenses to look through. Historians are asking new questions. What was the role of women? How did language and symbols shape events? How did the French Revolution connect to what was happening in America or in Haiti? The one big story has shattered into 1,000 smaller, fascinating pieces. But, and this is super important, after all the debates, after all the arguments about the how and the why, there is one thing that virtually every historian agrees on. The French Revolution was the watershed moment. It's the great dividing line in history. It's really where our modern world begins. So I guess the story of the French Revolution teaches us a valuable lesson. The battle over what happened in the past is never really over, and it kind of makes you think, doesn't it? One day, way in the future, historians are going to look back at our time. What's the simple story they're going to try to tell about us? And more importantly, what are all the messy, complicated, important details that they'll miss?